New Guinea, 1943. The jungle pressed in from all sides, thick and breathing, while steam rose from mud that never dried. In a clearing hacked from green darkness, 200 men stood silent, watching a converted bread truck roll to a stop. The engine died. The door opened, and Margaret Chambers stepped out wearing a blue uniform and a smile that seemed impossible in that place. She carried a tray of donuts, fresh donuts, the kind their mothers made. The men stared like she had descended from another world. Because she had. The war had already swallowed millions. Europe burned. The Pacific drowned men in jungles and coral atolls where the sun never stopped and fear never slept. American boys fought in places their parents couldn't pronounce, on islands that appeared on no map they'd ever seen. They wrote letters home describing heat that liquefied thought, insects that burrowed under skin, and a loneliness so profound it became another enemy. The Red Cross understood something the generals didn't. Men needed more than ammunition. They needed memory. They needed a moment when war stopped being war and became something else, something human. In late 1941, the American Red Cross began recruiting young women for overseas service. Not nurses, not administrative staff, something entirely new. They called the program Supplementary Recreational Activities Overseas. The women who joined would become known by a different name, a name that started as military slang and became legend. The Donut Dollies. The nickname traced back to World War I, when Red Cross women served donuts to troops in France. Helen Purviance, stationed near the front in 1918, fried donuts in a soldier's helmet, working through artillery fire while men lined up for something that tasted like home. The image stuck. When the Red Cross revived the program in 1941, the name returned with it. But these women would do more than serve pastries. They would bring America itself to the furthest edges of the world, carrying it in converted trucks, on transport planes, aboard ships that zigzagged through submarine-infested waters. They would set up in clearings still warm from battle, in hospital wards where men screamed through morphine dreams, on airfields where bombers returned with pieces missing. Margaret Chambers volunteered in the spring of 1943. She was 24, a teacher from Connecticut with dark hair and steady hands. The recruitment officer studied her application. "You understand what you're signing up for?" he asked. "This isn't stateside work. You'll be in combat zones. Real danger." Margaret met his gaze. "That's where the men are." The training lasted 6 weeks. Navigation, first aid, military protocol, equipment maintenance. They learned to change truck tires, purify water, operate field radios. They practiced serving donuts from moving vehicles, maintaining composure under simulated artillery fire, managing crowds of men who hadn't seen an American woman in months. The psychological preparation proved harder. Instructors warned them about what they'd witness: wounded men, dying men, men who'd lost limbs, faces, sanity, men who'd cry at the sight of them, men who'd propose marriage after a 10-minute conversation, men who'd been in combat so long they'd forgotten how to speak to women without stammering or staring at the ground. "You'll represent home," the chief instructor told them during the final briefing. "For many of these boys, you'll be the only American woman they see for months, maybe years. Some of them won't make it home. You might be the last woman they ever talk to. Remember that." In July 1943, Margaret and 23 other women boarded a transport ship in San Francisco. The voyage took 19 days, zigzagging across the Pacific to avoid Japanese submarines. They slept in converted cargo holds, woke to alarms warning of potential attacks, watched destroyers prowl the horizon like anxious wolves. The ship docked in Milne Bay, New Guinea, on August 3rd. Heat struck them like a physical blow. The air felt thick enough to chew, saturated with moisture and rotting vegetation. Insects swarmed in clouds. The jungle rose behind the base in walls of impenetrable green, alive with sounds that didn't belong to any world they knew. The base commander met them at the dock. Colonel James Patterson, weathered and skeptical, studied the women like they were equipment he hadn't requisitioned. "You're the Red Cross girls," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Margaret replied. Patterson gestured toward the jungle. We've got 8,000 men out there. Half of them have malaria. The other half are waiting to get it. We're fighting the Japanese and the environment, and I'm not sure which one's winning. You think donuts are going to help? Margaret held his gaze. I think we'll find out, sir. The clubmobile arrived 3 days later, shipped in pieces and assembled by engineers who seemed bemused by the entire concept. It was a converted delivery truck, painted olive drab, with serving windows on both sides and a compact kitchen inside. A generator provided power. A water filtration system ensured clean water for coffee and dough. Storage compartments held flour, sugar, coffee, powdered milk, and the other ingredients that would transform metal and machinery into something that tasted like civilization. The first morning, Margaret and 3 other donut dollies, Helen Porter from Iowa, Frances Chen from California, and Dorothy Walsh from Massachusetts, woke before dawn to prepare. The process required precision, mixing the dough to the right consistency in 100-degree heat, shaping each donut by hand, frying them in oil heated to exactly 375 degrees, brewing coffee strong enough to cut through exhaustion but smooth enough to savor. By 6 a.m., they were ready. The clubmobile rolled through the camp gates toward a clearing, where the 41st Infantry Division had assembled for morning briefing. 200 men stood in rough formation, grimy, hollow-eyed, already sweating through their uniforms. They'd been on patrol for 6 days, pushing through jungle so thick they measured progress in yards per hour. The truck stopped. Margaret opened the serving window. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said. "Coffee and donuts?" The formation didn't move. 200 men stared like they were witnessing an apparition. No one spoke. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Then someone in the back whispered, "Jesus Christ." The formation dissolved. Men surged forward, not running, not shouting, but moving with a desperate urgency that had nothing to do with hunger. They formed a line without being told, each man waiting his turn, reaching the window with trembling hands. Margaret served the first soldier, Private Michael Dawson, 19, from Nebraska. She placed 3 warm donuts on a paper napkin, poured coffee into a tin cup, and smiled. "Here you go," she said. "Fresh this morning." Dawson took the cup, stared at it, then looked at Margaret with eyes that had seen things no 19-year-old should see. "Ma'am," he whispered, "you look like my sister." He walked away before she could respond, carrying his coffee like it was something sacred. The line moved forward. Each man received 3 donuts and coffee. None of them spoke above a whisper. Some thanked her. Others just nodded. A few had tears cutting lines through the dirt on their faces. One soldier, a sergeant with a Purple Heart ribbon, stood at the window for a full minute before he could form words. "We thought they forgot about us out here," he finally said. Margaret met his gaze. No one forgot. They served 400 donuts that morning. When the line finally ended, the 4 women stood in the empty clubmobile surrounded by flour dust, and the smell of coffee, hands cramping, faces streaked with sweat. Helen Porter broke the silence. "Did you see their faces?" Dorothy Walsh nodded slowly. "We're not serving donuts. We're serving something else." She was right. The donuts themselves were symbolic. Warm, sweet, perfectly ordinary. The kind of food that belonged to a world where war didn't exist, where mothers made breakfast and sisters teased brothers and life unfolded in comfortable patterns. Holding a donut meant holding that world, if only for a moment. The war couldn't touch it. The jungle couldn't swallow it. For 3 minutes, while coffee cooled and sugar melted on tongues, these men stood in 2 worlds simultaneously. The psychological impact was measurable. After that first morning, the base chaplain, Captain Robert Klein, sought out Margaret. "I've been here 8 months," he said. "I've watched morale collapse like a physical thing. Men stop talking, stop writing letters. They fold inward. This morning, after you left, I heard laughter. Actual laughter. I saw men joking with each other, sharing stories about home. You gave them permission to remember." The donut dollies returned every morning. They established a routine that became sacred. Up at 4 a.m., dough mixed by 5. First batch fried by 5:30. Coffee brewed by 6. The clubmobile rolled out at 6:15, reaching different units on a rotating schedule so every man got fresh donuts at least twice a week. The work was brutal. The heat inside the clubmobile often exceeded 120 degrees. The flour attracted insects. The oil spattered burns on their arms. They served hundreds of men each morning, then returned to base, cleaned the equipment, restocked supplies, and collapsed for a few hours before starting again. But they never missed a morning. By September, the operation expanded. More clubmobiles arrived. More women joined the program. They spread across the Pacific Theater, setting up operations in New Caledonia, Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, Australia. Each location brought new challenges. In some places, they had to boil water for hours to make it safe. In others, they rationed flour so carefully that each donut became a mathematical exercise in resource management. The women adapted. Frances Chen, who spoke Mandarin and Japanese, began teaching basic phrases to soldiers preparing for combat. Helen Porter organized informal concerts where men sang songs from home. Dorothy Walsh wrote letters for wounded soldiers whose hands couldn't hold pens. Margaret Chambers started a mobile library, carrying books in the clubmobile and trading them with men who'd read the same paperback Western 30 times. The program evolved beyond its original purpose. The donut dollies became counselors, sisters, mother figures, friends. Men told them things they couldn't tell their brothers in arms, fears about whether they'd survive, guilt about things they'd done in combat, anxiety about girlfriends and wives who waited at home, grief for friends who died. In October 1943, Margaret met Private Thomas Chen, no relation to Frances, outside a field hospital in Milne Bay. He sat alone on an empty ammunition crate, staring at nothing. His left arm ended at the elbow, wrapped in white bandages already yellowed with sweat. Margaret approached quietly. "Would you like some coffee?" Thomas looked up. His face was 22, but his eyes were ancient. "They're sending me home," he said. "I should be happy, but I can't stop thinking about the guys still out there." Margaret sat beside him. "That's called caring about people. Don't apologize for it." "I wanted to go to college," Thomas said. "Stanford. Study engineering. Build bridges. Now I can't even button my own shirt." Margaret poured coffee into a tin cup and held it while Thomas drank. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun burn across the jungle canopy. "I knew a man who lost his arm in the First War," Margaret finally said. "He became an architect, designed half the buildings in New Haven. He told me once that losing his arm taught him to see structures differently, made him better at his job, not worse." Thomas looked at her. "You believe that?" "I believe what you do next is up to you, not your arm. You." The conversation lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, Thomas stood, nodded once, and walked back toward the hospital. Margaret never saw him again, but 3 years later she received a letter from Palo Alto, California. Thomas had enrolled at Stanford. The letter included a photograph of him standing in front of the engineering building, smiling, his right hand raised in a victory sign. The stories multiplied. In Guadalcanal, Helen Porter spent an entire afternoon talking with a sergeant who'd been in combat for 18 months without leave. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, jumped at every unexpected sound. Helen listened while he described nightmares where the jungle came alive and swallowed him whole. "I used to be brave," he whispered. "Now I'm scared all the time." Helen took his hand. "Fear doesn't mean you're not brave anymore. It means you're human. That's different." In New Caledonia, Frances Chen encountered a group of soldiers preparing for an amphibious assault on a Japanese-held island. They knew the casualty estimates. 70% wounded or killed in the first wave. They sat around a fire the night before departure, trying to pretend they weren't terrified. Frances set up the clubmobile near their camp. She served donuts until midnight, then sat with them talking about anything except the next day. Baseball scores, terrible jokes, memories of first dates and embarrassing moments with parents. At 3 a.m., when the fire burned low, one soldier asked her to sing. Frances had a clear, strong voice. She sang "You Are My Sunshine." and 30 men joined her, their voices rough and off-key but earnest. When the song ended, no one spoke. The jungle breathed around them. Somewhere in the darkness, birds called in languages older than war. One soldier, a corporal from Texas, stood and addressed the group. "Whatever happens tomorrow, remember this. Remember we were men before we were soldiers. We loved people, had dreams, made our mamas laugh. That's what we're fighting for, not the uniform, the people inside it." 22 men from that unit died in the assault. The 8 survivors later wrote letters to the Red Cross, all saying the same thing. That night, those hours around the fire, kept them human when the beach turned into hell. Francis Chen's voice singing, "You Are My Sunshine," played in their heads, while bullets snapped overhead and sand turned red. The donut dollies served in every major Pacific campaign. They were on Saipan 2 days after the Marines secured the airfield, frying donuts in a bullet-riddled clubmobile, while artillery boomed in the distance. They were in the Philippines when MacArthur returned, serving coffee to men who'd been fighting through jungles for months without relief. They were on Iwo Jima, on Okinawa, in places where the war was so loud and close that serving donuts felt like an act of defiance. The dangers were real and constant. Japanese artillery didn't discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. In January 1945, a clubmobile in the Philippines took shrapnel from a mortar round. The 4 women inside survived, but one, Emily Richardson from Ohio, lost 3 fingers on her right hand. She refused evacuation. 3 days later, she was back at the serving window, pouring coffee with her left hand, her right wrapped in bandages. "These boys need their donuts," she said when the base commander ordered her to seek medical treatment. "I can pour coffee one-handed." The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The Pacific War continued, grinding through islands and atolls with a brutality that seemed designed to break the human spirit. By summer, everyone knew an invasion of Japan was coming. The casualty estimates were apocalyptic. 500,000 American dead, more wounded. The donut dollies prepared to be part of the assault force. Then, in August, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The war ended not with a climactic battle but with a flash of light and a mushroom cloud. The donut dollies remained overseas for months after the surrender, serving occupation forces in Japan, the Philippines, and islands scattered across the Pacific. The work changed. The urgency dissolved. Men no longer faced immediate death, but they still needed what the donut dollies provided, a connection to home, a reminder that civilization existed beyond the war. Margaret Chambers served in Japan until March 1946. She spent her last weeks in Osaka, operating a clubmobile near the harbor where transport ships loaded soldiers for the voyage home. She served coffee to thousands of men, each one carrying memories they'd never fully share, scars that would never fully heal. On her final day, a veteran approached the window, Master Sergeant David Coleman, 32, from Montana. He'd been in the Pacific since 1942, 4 years of combat across a dozen islands. He looked at Margaret with eyes that had witnessed the full spectrum of human experience. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly, "not just for the donuts, for being here, for reminding us we were still human." Margaret handed him a cup of coffee. "You never stopped being human, we just helped you remember." Coleman nodded slowly. "I'm going home to a wife I barely know and a daughter who was 2 when I left. She's 6 now. I don't know how to be a father. I don't know if I remember how to be anything except a soldier." Margaret leaned forward. "You'll remember. It might take time, but you'll remember. Because that's who you really are. The soldier was temporary. The father is permanent." Coleman took the coffee, held it for a moment, then saluted with his free hand. Margaret returned the salute. He turned and walked toward the transport ship, and she never saw him again. But the impact of the donut dollies extended far beyond individual encounters. The program served over 5 million American servicemen during World War II. The women fried countless donuts, poured oceans of coffee, and logged millions of miles in converted trucks across terrain that ranged from desert to jungle to frozen tundra. The psychological impact was documented in military reports, chaplain journals, and thousands of letters soldiers wrote home. Time and again, men described the same phenomenon. Seeing a donut dolly, receiving a warm donut and a smile, reminded them why they were fighting, not for abstract concepts like freedom or democracy, but for the simple, profound reality of American life. Mothers who made breakfast, sisters who teased them, girlfriends who waited. A world where women wore blue uniforms and served coffee with smiles, and life unfolded in patterns that made sense. The program also transformed the women who served. They left America as teachers, secretaries, students, daughters. They returned as veterans, carrying their own memories and scars. Many struggled with what they'd witnessed, the wounded men, the dying boys who called for mothers who would never come, the endless grinding reality of war's aftermath. Margaret Chambers returned to Connecticut in April 1946. She resumed teaching, but found the classroom felt distant, disconnected from what she now knew about the world. She'd watched boys die on hospital cots, held their hands while morphine couldn't touch their pain, written final letters to parents who'd received folded flags and broken hearts. She couldn't talk about it, not to her family, not to friends who asked bright, cheerful questions about her adventure overseas. The gap between their understanding and her experience felt unbridgeable. In 1947, she received a letter from Helen Porter. Helen had struggled too, working a desk job in Des Moines while her nights filled with dreams of jungle clearings and men's faces pressed against serving windows. She'd started organizing reunions for Red Cross women who served overseas. Small gatherings where they could talk about what they'd experienced, share stories, remember together. Margaret attended the first reunion in Chicago that fall. 18 women gathered in a hotel conference room, many of them meeting for the first time since the war. They shared coffee, real coffee, not the military blend, and talked through the night. They talked about the heat inside the clubmobiles, the weight of serving 500 men before breakfast, the soldier who proposed marriage every morning for 6 weeks straight. The time Japanese artillery struck 100 yards from their position, and they kept serving donuts because the men needed normal more than they needed safety. They talked about the faces, the boy from Idaho who cried when he tasted his first donut because his mother made the same kind. The sergeant who couldn't speak just stood at the window with tears running down his face. The wounded men in hospital wards who said thank you with their eyes because their mouths couldn't form words. They talked about what it meant to carry home into war, to be the memory other people fought to defend, the weight of that responsibility, the honor of it. Frances Chen spoke near dawn, her voice quiet but steady. I used to think we just served donuts, like we were glorified waitresses, but we were witnesses. We saw these men at their most vulnerable, scared, wounded, homesick, lost, and we saw them be brave anyway. Keep fighting anyway. Stay human anyway. That's what I'll remember, not the donuts, the humanity we protected. The room fell silent. Outside, Chicago woke to an ordinary Tuesday morning. Inside, 18 women who'd seen war from the inside understood what Frances meant. They'd witnessed something profound. The capacity of human beings to remain decent in the face of horror. To crave connection in the midst of isolation. To find hope in a warm donut and a kind word from a woman in a blue uniform. The Donut Dollies program continued after World War II. Red Cross women served in Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts. The mission evolved, but the core purpose remained constant. Bring home to soldiers, provide connection, remind men and women in uniform that they were more than their weapons, more than their orders, more than the terrible things war required them to do. Margaret Chambers taught school for 30 years after the war. She married, raised 2 daughters, lived an ordinary American life in a small Connecticut town. But once a month she gathered with other Red Cross veterans in a local diner, drinking coffee and remembering. In 1985, a reporter from the Hartford Courant interviewed her for an article about World War II veterans. The reporter asked the standard questions. What was it like serving overseas? Were you scared? What do you remember most? Margaret thought for a long time before answering. I remember faces, she finally said. Thousands of faces. Boys who were so far from home they'd forgotten what home felt like. We gave them a donut and a smile, and for 3 minutes they remembered. They stood in our clearing with coffee in their hands, and they weren't soldiers anymore. They were sons and brothers and boyfriends. They were human. That's what I remember most. That we helped them stay human when everything around them was designed to make them forget. The reporter pressed for details, combat stories, danger, the dramatic narratives that make good copy. Margaret shook her head. It wasn't dramatic, she said. It was ordinary. Beautifully, perfectly ordinary. That was the point. We brought ordinary to places where ordinary didn't exist anymore. That was our victory, not against the Japanese, against the war itself. Margaret Chambers died in 1994 at age 75. Her obituary in the local paper mentioned her decades of teaching, her volunteer work, her surviving family. It noted in a single sentence that she'd served with the Red Cross during World War II. It didn't mention the thousands of soldiers she'd served. The conversations that saved lives by giving men reason to keep living. The coffee poured at dawn in jungle clearings while artillery rumbled in the distance. The way her smile became a symbol of everything worth fighting for. The donut dollies weren't warriors. They never fired weapons, never stormed beaches or flew combat missions. But they fought their own war, against despair, against the dehumanizing machinery of conflict, against the slow erosion of hope that came from too much death and too little memory of life before war. They fought with donuts and coffee and smiles and conversations, with their presence in places that seemed to exist outside civilization's reach, with their absolute refusal to accept that war could permanently transform men into things that weren't men anymore. And they won. Not every battle, not every soldier. Some men were too far gone, too deeply scarred by what they'd seen and done. Some carried rage and trauma that no donut could touch. Some died before the donut dollies reached them, falling in jungles and on beaches where American women never went. But for the millions they did reach, the impact was measurable and lasting. Post-war studies showed that soldiers who had regular contact with Red Cross women during their service experienced lower rates of post-traumatic stress. They reintegrated into civilian life more successfully. They maintained stronger family connections. They retained a sense of identity beyond their military service. The donuts themselves were almost irrelevant. It was what they symbolized. A world where women made breakfast, where coffee cooled in kitchens and families gathered around tables, and life followed rhythms that predated war and would outlast war. The donut dollies were mobile ambassadors from that world, carrying it across oceans, into jungles, onto islands where the only law was violence. In modern military psychology, the concept has a name: normalcy anchors. Small, consistent reminders of pre-combat life that help soldiers maintain psychological continuity across the boundary between peace and war. The donut dollies invented the concept before it had a name. Today, few remember them. The program ended decades ago. The women who served are mostly gone, taking their memories with them. The clubmobiles rusted in Pacific jungle clearings or were scrapped for parts. The photographs yellowed and faded, filed away in archives that few people visit. But the impact remains. In the millions of veterans who came home with enough humanity intact to rebuild lives. In the families they formed, the children they raised, the ordinary American existence they reclaimed from war's grip. In the simple, profound truth that even in humanity's darkest moments, kindness survives. Margaret Chambers understood this. In her final years, when age and illness confined her to a nursing home, she received occasional visits from men who'd served in the Pacific. Now, in their 70s and 80s, they'd tracked her down through Red Cross records, driven hours or flown across the country to say thank you. One veteran, a former private named James Sullivan from Boston, visited in 1992. He'd been at Milne Bay in August 1943, 19 years old, terrified, convinced he'd never see home again. "I've thought about that morning for 49 years, he told Margaret. "Standing in that line, seeing you in the window. You handed me a donut and smiled and said, 'Good morning.' like we were at a church social back home, like the war didn't exist. And for those few minutes, it didn't. You gave me proof that the world I was fighting for was real, not just memory, not just fantasy. Real. Margaret took his hand. Her grip was weak now, trembling with age, but her eyes were clear. "Tell me about your life," she said. "Your family. What you built after the war." Sullivan talked for an hour, about his wife of 45 years, his 4 children, his career as a high school principal, his 8 grandchildren, his ordinary, beautiful life that unfolded across decades in a small Massachusetts town. When he finished, Margaret smiled. The same smile she'd given him 50 years earlier, across a serving window in a jungle clearing on the other side of the world. "That's why we were there," she said. "For this. For all of this. You think you're thanking me for a donut, but I'm thanking you for proving it was worth it. That you built a life. That you stayed human. That the war didn't win." Sullivan left that afternoon, driving back to Boston with tears streaming down his face, mourning a woman who wasn't dead yet but soon would be. Margaret Chambers died 6 months later. At her funeral, attended by family and former students and friends from 60 years of ordinary American life, 7 elderly men sat in the back row, veterans who'd known her for 3 minutes in a jungle in 1943, who'd traveled from across the country to honor a woman who'd given them something more valuable than safety or victory. She'd given them memory, proof that the world they'd left behind was real and waiting for their return, that they were more than soldiers, more than weapons, more than the terrible necessities of war. They were men who deserved donuts and coffee and smiles from women in blue uniforms, men who deserved to go home, men who deserved to be remembered not for how they fought, but for what they fought to protect. The donut Dollies understood this truth before anyone gave it a name. They carried it across the Pacific in converted trucks, serving it with fresh donuts and hot coffee to millions of boys who needed reminding that they were human beings, not machines. And in the end, that was the greatest service anyone could provide. Not victory in battle, not strategic advantage, not military necessity. Simply this, the absolute, unwavering insistence that even in war, humanity survives, that kindness endures. That a woman can serve donuts in a jungle clearing while artillery rumbles in the distance, and by that simple act, declare that war does not get to define who we are. The donut Dollies proved it. 1 donut at a time, 1 cup of coffee, 1 smile, 1 conversation, 1 moment of ordinary beauty in the midst of extraordinary horror. And by those small acts, they won a victory that outlasted every battle. They saved not lives, but something more fragile and more essential. They saved the souls of men who'd been asked to walk through hell, and they did it by reminding them, again and again, that heaven existed, not in some distant future, not in abstract ideals, but here, now, in the simple act of a woman handing a donut to a boy who needed to remember his mother's kitchen. That was their war. That was their victory. And long after the last veteran dies, long after the last photograph fades, that truth will remain. Home is not a place, it's a memory. And sometimes, in the darkest moments, all we need to survive is proof that the memory is real. The donut Dollies were that proof, fresh every morning, served with a smile, carried across oceans to remind boys that they were men, that they deserved kindness, that they would, if they were lucky, if they were brave, if they held on to what made them human, eventually go home.